Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This podcast is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new online collection of practical, trusted resources made for those who support global missions from home. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com to register for access to this growing collection of tools for senders. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. I'm here again with Maddie DeSmit, our co-host. Hi, Maddie.
Hello. Good to be here.
I appreciate every single guest that we have on this podcast. And there are some whose ministries resonate so closely with the Global Missions Toolbox and the podcast. It's just a real delight. And today was one of those occasions, Maddie. Mm-hmm. And Maddie knows it happens today that we recorded the conversation earlier today with Nathan, and now we do the introduction. It's a real delight, and so we'll get to that right away. Just before we do, though, Maddie, I'd like to have you introduce our sponsor for today's episode.
Yes, we are so thankful for the partnership of today's sponsor to bring you this conversation. Our sponsor is Shepherd Staff, an organization that coaches churches to send and care for their own members sent to serve in mission. They serve the church with a vision of equipping missionaries for greater effectiveness on the field in gospel proclamation, disciple making, and church planting. You know that here at the Global Missions Toolbox, we think the church's involvement in sending is so important, and this is an organization who is ready to walk alongside your church as you seek to be faithful senders. They are even ready to help your church with important administrative needs in areas such as health insurance, retirement plans, and donation processing. You can learn more about Shepherd Staff and reach out to their team at ssmfi.org. That's ssmfi.org. Thank you again to Shepherd Staff for sponsoring this episode. And now let's get into today's conversation with Nathan.
Our guest today is Nathan Sloan, who serves as the Executive Director of Upstream Sending. This is a mission sending organization focused on putting the local church in the driver's seat of sending. And Nathan and I have already visited, just before we hit the record button here, about how closely this aligns with the Global Missions Toolbox and the Global Missions Podcast. This is right in the strike zone of what we're so often talking about, serving the local church as you out there faithfully participate in God's global work. Nathan has previously led global missions at his church in Louisville, Kentucky, and served as one of the teaching pastors there. And he and his wife, Sarah, have served as cross-cultural workers in Nepal. They were discipling young leaders and working with an unreached people group there. He's got 2 great kids and now makes his home in Louisville, Kentucky. Nathan, welcome to the Global Missions Podcast.
Thanks for having me. And let me commend you on the way you said Louisville. You said that very well.
Oh, thanks. The Canadian guy says it right.
That's great. That's great.
Well, it is a delight to visit with you today. As I said, Nathan and I already observed a resonance in vision for serving the church. Here, Nathan, we often say the church is the primary stakeholder in the Great Commission. Same thing as putting the local church in the driver's seat. Nathan is also an author, and we're going to talk about one of his books today. It's entitled You Are Sent: Finding Your Place in God's Global Mission. We'll hear more about the book, but just before we get to that, would you just sketch, Nathan, for us just a little bit of your missions journey?
Yeah, that's a really good question to start us. I came from a non-Christian home, culturally Christian background, but really as soon as I became a believer, was exposed to some degree to missions and just saw a vision for what could be and my place in it. And that developed over time, but to the point I spent a semester of college in China. I really wanted to work with among the persecuted church to be able to learn from people who were suffering and staying faithful. So I got to spend 4 months working with the house church in China. Wow. And with a veteran missionary, which shaped my missiology. It shaped my perspective on life. And then I went back and worked in a local rural church, learned how to love people, connected the dots between global missions and the local church. And there's just this aha moment. I was like, oh, I think these things go together. And then just a few years later, as a single man, I went to Nepal, Kathmandu, Nepal. I worked there for a term,
Mm-hmm.
met my wife. She was a single missionary, working with Tibetans. It's just God's gift, I think, to both of us. And when we came back stateside to raise some more support, God just began to do something in our lives to give us a picture of what we would call the sending church. This vision of a church on mission in Acts 11 through 18 in Antioch. And I realized that was not our experience. I had a wonderful church. My wife had a wonderful church, but they weren't a sending church. They didn't invest in us and raise us up and stay with us. And we didn't return. We weren't an extension of the body. We were just
Mm-hmm.
sent. So we ended up resigning from our organization and planting roots in a church plant and kind of doing that side of missions, not just the senders, but really trying to create culture in a church, of a church on mission locally and globally. And then over the last decade of seeking to do global missions in a local church, I just realized there were opportunities to help other churches catch a vision for the sending church. So that's when we really launched Upstream Sending 2 years ago. So anyway, it's been a really fun journey from, midterm experience to local church back into the church, and then now in an agency role.
That's really good. Well, as we mentioned, Nathan is an author, and we're going to discuss a few topics from his most recent book. Let me ask you this. What motivated you to write this book? It's a 2022 book for those listening. What motivated you, Nathan, to write this book, and why now?
One of the values we had as a church, we really valued raising up and sending people out in our body. Mm-hmm. So we had this internal missionary training school, and it was our bread and butter. But honestly, over time, even though it was very effective in what it did, we weren't really discipling our people to the nations. We were kind of taking people who already felt a call. We were more of a finishing school. And I was like, man, we need a resource that takes people from general interest to more deep missiology and exposure and equipping, discipling, right? We needed a global missions discipleship tool. Mm-hmm. And there are other things out there, but when I looked around, they were either too academically robust. That's not a negative. It's just not what we needed. They were too expensive. We're an urban church money is not a resource that we have. And I was like, I think there needs to be something different, something that's not seminary level, but something that's not a 20-page PDF. There's got to be something in the middle. Mm-hmm. And I remember I was actually sitting in a group, meeting with a group of mission pastors from around America, mm-hmm. and several of them said the same thing. And I was like, you know what? We kind of do that in our church. Let's formalize it and write a book. So I wrote this book for my local church, but with an eye for other churches who were asking for the resource.
Mm-hmm. Well, we appreciate it. I'm not deeply familiar with it. I was introduced to it this week in preparation for our conversation, but already I'm really excited about this. And I think for some of our community in Canada, it could be a good fit tool as well, Nathan. So thank you for the effort that you've invested to put that together and to generously get it out to many folks. Today with Nathan, we're going to dive into the theme of weakness in missions. This is only one part of the book, by the way, or one theme throughout the book, but that'll be our main theme here today, weakness in missions. And Nathan, right off the hop, it sounds a little counterintuitive. Aren't we supposed to identify our strengths and gifts and talents and then leverage those for the glory of God? And here you are talking about weakness in mission. What's going on here?
Yeah, I am a firm believer that the majority of things in life are a both and, not an either or. Mm-hmm. Proper self-awareness, understanding how God has gifted and equipped us is beautiful and helpful. However, specifically those in the West, and may I say specifically those from America, are not known for embracing their weakness or having a proper understanding of some of those aspects of our life. So I think it's just an area of missions, the church life in general, but specifically because of our conversation today, an area that is so important to understand the virtue and value of weakness in global missions. It's not just a reality, it is, but I think it's also a tool to see the Great Commission expand.
Well, we just did a recent interview with Justin Schell. I'm not sure in the order of the podcasts being published, what order, whether that'll be before the interview with you or afterwards. But our discussion with him was about the global nature of the church and the body of Christ, and how there are strengths rising up in the purposes and plans of God through other parts of the world, even to complement where we are not strong, and the beauty of all of that fitting together. And just having a humility that says we have a place to contribute, and to be aware that maybe we don't have everything to contribute.
I mean, honestly, in our little organization, we have a value to listen to global voices, specifically those of the global South. And I sat with a Kenyan brother who I trust immensely, and I've built enough trust where he will be honest with me. And he recounted a story of his lead pastor in Kenya, and they had a conference of global leaders from Middle East and from Asia and Southeast Asia and other places. And they're all coming together learning, but there was no American there. And this Kenyan was talking to an American pastor, and the American pastor said, why was someone not there? And the Kenyan pastor just said, because in our world, the Westerner is a 600-pound gorilla. Even if they don't want to be, it's intimidating. There's history, there's assumption. And that should be a conviction to us in the West. This should bring us pause and say, I mean, we can spend multiple episodes on what we have done wrong in missions. But to say, okay, what do we do right moving forward? And some of that, the answer to that is to learn and embrace weakness in our lives and the words and virtues that surround weakness. I'm sure we'll talk about some of those, but a theology of suffering, of humility, the posture of a learner, all of those are things that we will learn and should learn from the global church.
Yeah. It's beautiful in the body. And praise the Lord that you have a dear brother that has the courage to speak clearly to us like that in the West. Hey, so very helpful. So we have chosen weakness in mission as the general theme for today's conversation, and we are going to use 3 key ideas that Nathan has identified here. The first is posture. I'm not going to just ask you each. I've got them on the list here, Nathan. So the first idea has to do with our posture. How does a healthy posture fit with our idea of weakness in mission?
So I think it's an interesting concept, this idea of a posture. And I first started thinking about it years ago. I was sitting in a church planning conference in Europe, and it was, I mean, again, a Western context, but a European context, serving with men and women who are in countries where Christianity is postmodern, that kind of concept, right? Small churches, it's just a different makeup. And I remember talking about people from North America coming and joining them, and there's a hesitation. And again, what they helped me understand is if you want to send someone who would come and serve under our leadership, who would come and learn and serve in community on a team, we would love to have those people. And it just got me thinking, what are they speaking to? And they're speaking to this concept of posture. Are we sending people from our churches that have a posture of humility, a posture of a learner? I'm not talking about culture and language adaptation, although that's part of it. But the person who's been on the field for 3 terms, 4 terms, 30 years, 40 years, do they still maintain that posture of a learner? Someone who has a proper understanding of themselves, gifts, strengths, both. Someone who understands that there is ethnocentrism in them, right? Even if maybe they're not leading out with that, but just the awareness, like, yes, I prefer my own culture. Sometimes I look down upon all the other cultures and other people, and being able to kind of own some of those things. So those are just different concepts. But when it comes to actually sending and engaging in global missions, I think a question that's really helpful is, are we willing from the West to go and serve in a way where we're submitting to the leadership and the vision and authority of people who are not like us?
That's it.
People who, it's just different, right? So posture in missions is
it's very, very good.
A characteristic, a trait that is needed when we're both preparing missionaries, we're assessing missionaries, but also long-term on the field.
So let me ask you this then. A missions committee in a church says, this is a great idea, Nathan. How do we watch for that in our local congregation? What are some of the clues in your experience that are evident or evidence this posture of a learner in prospective goers?
Yes, this is perfect that this is happening in the context of a local church, right?
Yeah.
Assessment and development happen best in the context of a local church. Why? Listen, we could have a candidate come to our organizations. We can do our best to read applications, to ask questions, to get to know them. But what a church is able to do is to live life with people week after week, month after month, year after year. So that missions committee is able to say, hey, I saw you cleaning up puke from a kid at Vacation Bible School. I saw you show up and help that widow. I'm noticing, I'm observing, I'm assessing a posture of humility, of service, of a learner. So I think that would be an answer is like, hey, don't just, yes, I think we should formalize an assessment and sending process, but every process, I'm speaking to the goer now, every process should be both formal and relational. Everybody, and not to intimidate people, but we are assessing our people all the time, both when you sit down and have a meeting, but what does a person do when suffering comes? What does a person do? Here you go. What does a person do when they don't get the answer they want from the missions committee or from the pastor or whoever? How do they respond to that?
Well, all of these things resonate, and you can hear in Nathan's comments the centrality of the church. And some of our agencies are really wrestling to make sure that that stays paramount there. It is, we sometimes say, Nathan, the best laboratory for preparation and for discernment is in the sending church before the agency. The agency will help, but just really good to observe in real everyday life, ongoing, what's not on paper, so to speak. So a posture of a learner is one of the things that we want to build into our perspective on weakness in missions. The second idea, Nathan, you call renewal missions. Now we understand posture of a learner intuitively, but renewal missions, that needs a little unpacking. What do you mean by this concept?
It does. Let me say this. This is not my terminology. This comes from a sending organization called Surge.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And a guy named Jack Miller, who is deeply loved by many, specifically in the Reform circles. And the concept that they have, Surge doesn't just send missionaries. They have helped pastors and leaders and Christians wrestle with this idea of sonship theology, and specifically for our conversation today, this renewal missions. So think about renewal missions like this, like a cycle.
Yeah.
Okay, so think of maybe a water wheel or a circle that continues. And as we move out on mission for Jesus, which is what we want to encourage people to do, right? What they're going to realize is they are weak and broken and they need Jesus desperately. They need the gospel. The gospel isn't just a message they deliver. It's a message that transforms their life. It brings them hope. So that movement out on mission draws them back into life with Jesus. And as they're drawn back into life with Jesus, and abiding life, dependence, joy, all that comes with experiencing the gospel for ourselves, it pushes them back out on mission, which then pushes them back to Jesus. So this renewal mission, this cycle of, I would say, the life of a healthy missionary displays renewal missions. And in reality, the life of a healthy Christian is this outworking of renewal mission. So if I may give an example. So my wife and I are adoptive and foster parents. It's been one of the greatest joys of our life, and it may be the hardest thing we've ever done. So we see a need, and God compels us to move out, much like he does someone going overseas, and we step into a system, be it, let's say the foster system. We move into the foster system, we open our home, and we welcome in a child, and maybe we have a romanticized view of what that is, and it ends up being really difficult and hard and suffering and beautiful. And what it does is it shows us our lack. It shows us our weakness. And then we lean into Jesus like never before. Jesus, help us, grow us, meet this child, help us love them. And that pushing back into Jesus, we are given life and hope. And then we push back out into the life of the child, into the foster system and adoption. So you can play this out in missions, in foster care, whatever it is, but this cycle of dependence and mission should be happening in our life constantly.
That's really good. It's a simple diagram in Nathan's book, and we'll make sure that we get that little diagram put into the show notes too. But feeding one on the other and creating a positive cycle of growth and fruitfulness, renewal, missions. So far we've looked at these ideas of having the posture of a learner and renewal missions. In just a moment, we'll have Nathan share with us the third idea on this topic regarding weakness in missions. We'll also discuss some implications for the senders, those of us who may not be going, but supporting the goers, and we'll share some resources. Just before we get to that part of our conversation, we'd like to share with you this week's featured tool that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Today's featured tool is a guide to planning a commissioning service. The commissioning service is a special time for new missionaries about to leave their home country for the mission field, and is meant to honor the missionary and encourage the church congregation. This guide to planning a commissioning service will help you plan a thoughtful service that uses the opportunity for the good of your church community. In it, you will find suggested aspects to include in your service, examples of an order of service from other churches, and tips and resources to consider as you plan. This tool has been contributed by a team and can be found on our website, globalmissionstoolbox.com, or by clicking the link in the show notes of this episode.
We are back with Nathan Sloan, the Executive Director of Upstream Sending and the author of the book we're discussing, You Are Sent, Finding Your Place in God's Global Mission. So Nathan, we've already discussed these two ideas of a posture of learning and renewal missions. Tell us about the third idea you'd like to share with us today.
This is the idea that I think I have both experienced the most and have done the most thinking on it. It's this concept of a theology of suffering. So even as we go back to the global church, how much we can learn, how essential a theology of suffering is. And I would say in the Western world, this is one of our greatest liabilities, is a lack of a theology of suffering. I've spent quite a long time training and developing missionaries from a local church, and I've talked with other mission pastors, and really have had three reflections about the pre-filled preparation of missionaries. And there are at least three things that were vital. There's a lot more, obviously.
Sure.
But one of them is abiding life with Jesus.
Yeah.
Another is preparing people for interpersonal conflict, team conflict, because that will happen and it catches people off guard. But the other is developing a theology of suffering. What I mean by that is suffering. The scripture calls us to not be surprised by the fiery trial that's coming, this suffering, because as we read the scripture with that theme of suffering, it's everywhere. Philippians 1 verse 29 says that we've been given the gift of salvation and suffering. Yes, suffering is a result of sin, but like so many things, God uses it to expand the kingdom. The church historically has grown off the back of suffering. It is the very outworking of what we see in Matthew 5, of the Beatitudes, this idea of the kingdom turned upside down. Well, our world works like this way, but the kingdom of Jesus works like this way. There's no way that there's good in suffering. There's no way that God builds his church off of that, yet he does. And when we go overseas as missionaries, we may have read that academically. Maybe we've experienced some suffering, but actually having a theology that undergirds long suffering, over and over again, I see Western missionaries surprised by that. They just haven't grasped, many of them, that suffering is actually a means of mission and of the transformation of us. And I remember talking with one of my mission pastor friends, and this is one of his catchphrases, is that God is he's concerned as much with what he is doing in you as he is through you.
Through you. Yeah. That's so
God's
good.
plan for your life, being a cross-cultural missionary, may be to shape you more than he is using you to accomplish something. And we just, in our Western missiology, we don't think in those categories, yet suffering is just a reality in the world of missions.
Right. Well, it's a good word for us, and we need to hear it over and again. I agree with you. In the West, we tend to avoid suffering. It's something to be avoided, and that's understandable and maybe even appropriate. And the way God uses it, so very important. I appreciated what you mentioned in that short list of 3. This will resonate with you listeners if you were with us a few episodes ago with Dick Brogdon. Building resilience for the missionary task is completely aligned with what Nathan just said, that our deep theology of the goodness of God, no matter what, including the very difficult things that he allows or brings to pass, is the foundation of many faithful mission servants' lives. It's unlooked for, but it is God's goodness and our confidence in that, cultivating that. Building resilience is a challenging thing. And again, it's something that an agency can help guide some thinking around that, but a lot of that's going to take place in the sending church, right, Nathan? Like life takes place before a goer goes in a real life context. And that's where we can learn some of these things.
That's right. I think you can both, as senders, as the church, who walk with people as they suffer, but then we use that as a means of discipleship as someone is suffering. And then we give people opportunities to walk with those who are suffering. I just wanted to read this in relation to our conversation.
Sure.
This is the words of a very famous missionary named Paul. He said, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses." Why? So that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecution, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. This is not the theology of the West. This is the theology of the Bible. And if we are going to prepare our people to make a difference in the kingdom and to survive and thrive overseas, we have to make this at the forefront of how we are preparing our people.
Wonderful topic to touch on. I'm glad that we have come to this point. It's very helpful, Nathan. Now, I wonder what you would say. The goers will wrestle with suffering, but let's come to our senders again. Many of our listeners are serving faithfully in their churches, and they won't be the goers necessarily. What would you like to say to senders about this topic of weakness in mission?
Yeah, I think there's all kinds of things you could say. I think it is like, hey, even in your own life and in your church, what is happening through suffering, that is not something to be avoided, but something to be understood and to learn from. But primarily, this is I think what I would say to, let's say, a missions committee who's preparing to send someone or who has someone on the field. Mm-hmm. I would challenge them to rethink how they evaluate effectiveness of the people they send, and how they read updates, and how they hear the answers to the questions they ask. Meaning, what God is doing on the field is not just producing numbers of people or churches. Sometimes God gives us seasons of desert and of suffering. And then the other thing I would say in that same realm is, if our missions committees and our missions pastors and our missions leaders can develop a theology of suffering in the way they lead people, so that missionaries can actually be honest. Hey, we've stepped out in faith. This is really hard. We're experiencing a lot of suffering. I remember talking to one of our missionaries one time, and we had developed this culture within our church of leading with your weak foot forward. Missionaries are broken people too, that concept. Like, we're going to take the missionaries and we're going to pull them down off the pedestals we put them on, and they're ordinary people who are just living out faithfully. I was talking with one of our missionaries in India, and he was saying, hey, can I tell you about the season I'm in? I wake up every morning. I don't want to get up. I don't want to go outside. But I take my keys, I open the door, and I throw them down the stairs. I was like, why do you do that? He's like, well, I have to go get my keys because I've just thrown them down 3 flights of stairs. So by the time I get to the bottom, I'm like, okay, I'm this far. I can go out the door. Okay, I'm this far. I can go to the tea shop. And what that showed to me is like the beauty and their faithfulness in the midst of real life. And if we could be mission committees and church leaders that honors and has empathy and encourages, I think we'll create a culture in our sending churches that is actually healthier, embracing suffering, than if we didn't.
Mm-hmm. Wow, so very helpful. And Maddie, our producer, I know is in the background here. Maddie, I just can't remember which interview it was, just in case you can, where we were talking with someone about a well-intentioned home church hearing about a mission worker who was facing a difficult situation, Nathan. And the instinct of the church was to say, we got to get them out of there. Like they're suffering. We need to support them and get them out of there. And I want to say that sometimes that might be the right situation for a family or for a worker that needs to be moved. But the encouragement of this guest was to say, let's not move to that too quickly, too soon. Let's not create those escape patterns that just say, if it's hard, therefore it's not right. And that's what we hear you saying, Nathan, here, is that there is discernment and perseverance that sometimes will require a faithful worker to say, I've got to find the way to throw my keys down the stairs. And by then I can have enough movement to keep some inertia going forward. I hear some similar things in what you're saying here. It just resonates that we can't always look to escape the difficult.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that is a good question for churches and for a lot of us is so we talk about the theology of suffering. You can also talk about the theology of risk. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I realize there's nuances to this. There's qualifiers.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure.
At least a piece of the puzzle is the question, is Jesus worth it? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You ask our brothers and sisters overseas who lose jobs, who lose houses, who lose loved ones, is it worth it? I have a friend who is from North Africa who people from our church faithfully invested in for years. And they wanted a pastor to come and meet with him. So I came and met with them. They had been doing the hard work of evangelism. Mm-hmm. And I just rehearsed the gospel. And I knew enough to know that there's sacrifice. He was like, Pastor Nathan, if I take this step, I might lose my wife. I might lose my family. I might lose my job. And my response is yes, you may. And I'm dialoguing with this guy. It's just amazing. I will always remember this. I'm dialoguing with this guy about the suffering he may lose if he follows Jesus. And he starts screaming at the top of his lungs, I believe, I believe, mm-hmm. I believe. And in that moment, the Spirit grabbed his heart and he said, I am worth it. Jesus is worth whatever sacrifice, whatever suffering you can experience. And we in the Western church have lost the beauty of that. So if you want to be a good sending church, if you want to love your missionaries, allow suffering to be a reality that we can sit in.
Well, some precious thoughts here. I also, Nathan, want to speak with a gentleness and an understanding to loved ones of our faithful workers, the servants, the goers. And here again to plant some ideas with our sending churches and ask, how will we as senders be alongside the loved ones of our goers who release their precious ones to go to some of these places that may have elevated levels of risk or suffering? And how do we support the goers and the immediate senders? What is the role of the local church in loving the grandparents and the aunts and uncles, so to speak? Those people come to mind, but there will be others. That we do this together and we support each other, because it can be very, very challenging to watch your loved ones, the family, as it were, of the friend you mentioned, Nathan, who puts his keys down the stairs. How do we lovingly be alongside as the body of Christ, those who love him from here and don't want him to come home too soon either, right?
Yeah. I think even asking those kinds of questions. How beautiful is if we can get to a place as sending church leaders that we are asking the secondary and tertiary questions in sending that allow us to say, what is for the lack of a better term, secondary trauma that could be experienced from this? So two things come to mind. I remember talking with missionaries, and one of the things I would say early on is, one of the questions I'm asked is, when do we tell our parents that we're going to go overseas? Mm-hmm. Right? And, non-believing parents, believing parents, everybody has a hard time with it. And they should. I totally get it. And my word of wisdom to them is, hey, you can't predict how your parents are going to respond. And I just want to encourage you to give grace and space for however they respond. Because here's the deal. You are called to missions. They're not. So as much as they love Jesus, as much as they love you, as much as maybe they want you to follow Jesus, they're going to grieve because they're losing something. And that is real.
Yeah.
And for churches to do this, how do we support our missionaries and our missionary mamas and papas and grandmas in a way that shows empathy and can be encouraging? I just was in a board meeting today with our org, and we're producing a new book. I think it's around Mother's Day, but it's called Missionary Mamas. And the idea is this lady whose children live overseas, the journey she's been on. She wrote a book about how to help other mamas, other
Wonderful.
mothers of missionaries. So I think it's just thought patterns like that.
Yep.
It's not just I can get into the mobilization, right? Like, yeah, for the
Yep.
nations, or
Mm-hmm.
like, hey, do we need to equip and empower missionaries? We need to focus on them. But it's also, what are the other things that actually allow good shepherding and pastoring in these areas of sending?
So many of these ideas resonating deeply, Nathan. I'd like to ask you about resources that you might recommend if listeners would like to think more, learn more about this. Just while Nathan thinks on that and gets any comment ready, there are a number of previous episodes in the podcast that we will include in the show notes. Maddie has already created a list: building resilience for the missionary task, disability in mission, mobilizing people who aren't perfect for missions, lessons from the Chinese house church. Not too long ago, an episode where we heard here in the West, we heard from our sisters and brothers in the East who have suffered and been persecuted. What do they have to say to us? Look for that in the show notes. Nathan, resources that you might mention.
Yeah, I've been helped tremendously by Tim Keller's Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. The first part is actually a theology of suffering, and the second part is what suffering has looked like in his church and how he shepherded them. So it has helped me. It's given me framework that has just been really, really helpful. The book, The Insanity of God, which is similar in what you were talking about, just the story of the persecuted church, what we learned from them, and like really what does that mean for our own Christian lives? I think that Nick was doing different things with that book, but what it has done for me preparing missionaries is to give them a good picture of the global church.
Super. We'll link to an interview with Nick also. We did a few months back as well. So, yeah.
I was just going to say Elizabeth Elliot has written too many things to mention in this idea of suffering and mission. So you can grab any of her books and she's going to give a good worldview of stuff like this.
Really good. If any of our listeners would like to follow up with you, learn more about the organization that you're helping to lead, how do they reach back to you, Nathan?
You can go to our website, it's upstreamsending.com, and then we have a part of our ministry. We provide some resources at the upstreamcollective.org, but then you could also email me. It's nathan@upstreamsending.com. Happy to help if I can.
Well, thank you. And appreciate your accessibility to sisters and brothers who want to do a great job of this and think it through and begin to even maybe make adjustments. The last question that I like to pose to most of our guests, Nathan, is this. If you have the opportunity to stand before a missions committee, group of people in a local church who really want to do missions well from their community, from their congregation, and the pastor is there as well, they're aligned in heart and purpose, what would you like to say to that group?
Yeah, I would probably reiterate some of the things we have talked about. Specifically related to this topic is missionaries are ordinary people who follow an extraordinary God. And the best way to be a good sending church is have a proper expectation of broken people. You want missionaries who are weak and dependent on Jesus. So when you read their newsletters, when you make Zoom calls, when you go to visit them, create a culture in your relationship where brokenness is not just acceptable, but it's expected. And then you can have a posture of empathy and encourage. What most missionaries want from their, not just sending churches, but from their friends is an empathetic ear, presence, right? If you have pastored all or you've suffered with anyone, you know People don't want your words necessarily. They want you to sit down, to hold their hand, and to be with them. And most missionaries are, I'll answer it this way. I remember talking to the church I worked at is fairly large. We have a pastor of care. And I remember him asking me, hey, we have several care cases happening. Could you take some more care cases on, like walk with some families? Because you're carrying less than other pastors. And I'm like, Pastor, we have X number of missionaries, and they're all in a constant state of crisis. They're all needing care. So just as you think about your missionaries, know that being on the front lines of ministry, we need as churches to have a posture of care, love, vulnerability, those types of postures to our people.
Well, friends, this has been Nathan Sloan from the Upstream Sending Group organization. All the notes in the show notes you can find there at globalmissionspodcast.com. Nathan, thanks so much for spending this time with us today and just glimpsing through your book. Thanks again for that contribution, and we pray for the Lord's blessing as you step forward.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real joy.
Well, that was a great conversation with Nathan. We're so glad he joined us for this episode, and we hope you found it as helpful and encouraging as we did. As we close, Mags, are there any highlights that you'll take away from this conversation?
It's always so hard. That's such a hard question. But anyway, I think my key takeaway is how will we be alongside the families of the goers? And how will our agency, because you and I do serve with an agency, Send, how will we help churches be equipped to care for the extended families? It's to call it suffering. It's a type, I guess. There's going to be distance and there's going to be separation and there's release of loved ones to serve, often in faraway places. It's just one of the ways, one of the ideas that I took away from today's episode. Mm-hmm. How about you, Maddie?
Yeah, I think what I would take away is just the idea of suffering and how Nathan spoke to that, the necessity of having a theology of suffering. And it reminded me, like you mentioned in the episode of our conversation with Dick Brogden and on resilience for the missionary task. And in both that episode and what Nathan shared in this conversation, I thought it was just so helpful and such a good reminder. So that's what I'm taking away from this episode.
Very good. We also want to again extend our thanks to the sponsor for today's episode, Shepherd Staff, ssmfi.org, where you can check out that organization. We so appreciate their willingness to help make this podcast happen.
This podcast is a part of the Global Missions Toolbox. We hope you'll stop by our website to check out this online collection of resources, especially for senders, the pastors, missions committees, and family and friends of workers sent to serve in missions. We hope you will join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.